Welcome, everybody, to Anchor Conversations. This is Jason. I'm here with Tyler. Tyler, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. And welcome to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was a very cordial way to begin this whole thing. I'm bringing the energy because I'm starting this today because you preached on Sunday, so it's my turn to ask you the questions. Um, and I appreciate you saying welcome to me, even though, you know, normally it's the other way. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, you know what?
Welcome.
I appreciate your appreciation of me. Is it uncommon to welcome someone after you've already been welcomed by them? Like is that
It is. It threw me off a
is
little bit.
is that okay though? Like are we okay with that
Um,
in society, or is that like something that is a big problem for people?
it feels a little bit like if I were to come over to your house, because you're like hosting something, and I walk in and you're like, "Welcome, thanks for being here," and I'm like, "Welcome back to you. Thanks for being here." That's the
Well,
kind of
I
how it
mean,
felt.
there's a lot of times where someone will say thanks for being here, and then you'll say thanks for having me over. So
Yeah.
that's, kind of similar, but
No, not
yeah,
similar at
no.
all, because I said, "Hey, thanks for being on the podcast," and all you could have said was, "It's great to be here," which would have been the exact same thing. But instead, you said, "Thank you also for being here." It was like, "You're welcome." We're just being a very cordial environment that we have going on here. And you know what? Let me say this to you. Thanks for being here in your car or on your run or whatever you're doing, listening to Anchor Conversations. Thank you also for being here.
And
It's great
everyone
to have
say
you.
with me in your minds, thank you for being here.
Yeah, seriously. Thank you for being here. Okay. No?
So all we've established is that we're all here voluntarily and we're all
hmm
grateful for each other's presence.
hmm
And if there is someone out there who has a gun held to their head and they're listening to this right now because they are not, it's not voluntary, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you are not part of the welcome.
And thank you for being here. May the Lord change your life. Yes, it took a little
Yes,
bit of a dark turn there. I
it
don't
did.
know.
I'm sorry.
I'm not really sure what happened, but that was a dark road we just went down. Let's pull out of that one here, I guess. Um, before we jump into anything else, let me just remind you all, if you're listening to this podcast and you're not with us at church and your cell phone doesn't work, so you're not getting any text messages, you forgot your email password, so you're not seeing that, and you have no social media, so you have no idea that this Sunday we are not at Courts Hill. Let me just tell you right now, it's July 14th, this upcoming Sunday, Quartz Hill's floors are being redone, and they asked us not to be in there. So you're going to be going to one, if you're in a community group, your community group or somebody in your community group is going to be hosting that. You'll be hearing from them at some point. If you're not in a community group, they're going to be hosting gatherings. So they're not hosting their community group. I just want to make that clear. We would like you to go to find a gathering near you. So um, remember your email password, go on there. There's links for you to go and figure out where the homes that are the gatherings are going to be. The addresses are on there, and so you can figure out which one's close to your house. And if you could do me a favor, if that's you, you're in that situation, would you just please fill out that little Google form that we have show, kind of saying where all the things are. You'll see it if you click on the link, because I just want to make sure that all the hosts know how to get a hold of you to let you know if they're doing any food or anything like that, or so that they also know how many people are coming. So if you could please do that, that'd be great. There's going to be 4 or 5 different gatherings around the East Valley this Sunday at 10 a.m., not at Quartz Hill, so please don't go there. So to make sure we said that before we get started, just in case anybody, falls down on their run and they can't finish the podcast or something like that. And so just make sure this Sunday you know what's going on. Check social media and check the newsletters coming out tomorrow or today. I guess it's coming out today, Wednesday. So uh, with that being said, we finished. We're almost finished with, I should say, summer. I know that there's actually school starting, I think, in like a week, which is totally crazy. Doesn't it seem like school just got out and there's already school starting? Um, so we're finishing with the summer, essentially officially. We're also finishing with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are done after this past Sunday. Tyler, you preached to us, kind of closing out the series from Matthew 5, 11, and 12. Your big idea was rejoice in Christ as you bear the marks of Christ. And It really was both a reminder for us of what it means to live our lives for Jesus, even though living our lives for Jesus does come with certain scars, I think, that we wind up bearing, which makes sense because Jesus told us that that would happen. So following Jesus is a hazardous journey in a lot of ways, but it's worth it. And you kind of finished up the Beatitudes with that. If you weren't out there on Sunday, there was a lot of you on vacation. I know it was 118 degrees, so hot. And you missed the pool night, by the way. If you weren't there, it was amazing. It was great. We had a great time. But if you missed on Sunday, go listen to the sermon. It really is the recap of the whole Beatitudes. And Tyler, I think you did a great job of just kind of recapping the whole thing. Some really good takeaways from that. We did get a text question in, and just let me just say this: I love text questions. It's really helpful for us. If you're ever at a spot where you're like, I should text this, but it doesn't really matter. Maybe you just think, oh, I don't want to, maybe you don't want to seem like somebody that doesn't know the answer. And so you don't want to text it in. Or maybe you're just like, they don't want to get texts, or you're just debating whether or not you should actually do it. Always default to just sending one in. It's really helpful for us because it helps us to try and gauge certain things that we may have missed. I think the last 2 weeks we've had questions, and it's so helpful, even as we're talking through the podcast. So please send them in. The number is always on the screen on Sunday mornings. You can just shoot a quick text in there. Here's the question we got, Tyler. Can you explain more how someone might be experiencing persecution in ways you might not be expecting? You mentioned that we don't always, we don't always experience persecution maybe the same ways that the Christians would have in the New Testament, in the church age there with Paul, or even in some parts of the world right now. We kind of think of persecution as you're not allowed to preach the gospel, or physical harm will come to you, or something like that. So you mentioned there might be ways that you might not be expecting. Can you just expound upon what that looks like, maybe, or some ways that might play itself out?
Yeah, I mean, I could be crazy here, but one of the things that I think might be helpful is Christians today in our culture and our context think about persecution. Another word that might be helpful, not to substitute because persecution is a biblical word, but to pair with that is maybe the idea of opposition. Because I think when we hear persecution, there's certain connotations we have to that, which is the people being, martyred by the state, or, killed by non-Christians or whatever. And there are a lot of our brothers and sisters around the world who are experiencing that. Like, make no mistake, that's true. But I think if we were to think about it in terms of opposition, I think it helps us to be aware that there are forces, both flesh and not flesh, that are opposed to the gospel, and that opposition might come in ways that is really sweet to us. So I was thinking about, we call it the temptation of Jesus. You could also call it the persecution or the opposition that Satan comes to Jesus and offers to try and throw him off of the mission. And it wouldn't fit in our typical kind of box of persecution, because Satan is not threatening his life, and he's actually not threatening to take anything away from Jesus. He's offering him more than what he has. He's actually offering the kingdom, but in a kind of shortcut manner, and a lesser version, a cheap knockoff version of the kingdom. And so that's something that I think, as we consider persecution, we should think about is it could be that the opposition is an offer of more, which is, I think, probably counterintuitive for us. But Satan comes to Jesus and opposes him with an offer of provision, an offer of position, an offer of power, and all of those things are provided in the kingdom. But the way that the temptation comes is through this kind of shortcut route of, even thinking about like the temptation of throw yourself off of this building. And essentially, it's almost like a pseudo resurrection. Throw yourself off this building. I'll save you. It'll be like you're going to die, but you won't. It mirrors the resurrection, but it's not. And I think that there's opposition. And again, I think most of this would not be fleshly. I think that this would be, in the spiritual places, there's oppositions to the gospel going forward. If you read the Old Testament, the times that the people of God are least faithful is when they're most prosperous. And so I don't think that's accidental. I just think that opposition sometimes can be, a flooding of our lives with distractions and with really good things that should not be God things, but it's really hard for them not to be God things. And so the invitation from Jesus is to lose your life and you will find it. And that's exactly what he did with Satan. He said, no, I'm not going to take your offer of um, having the kingdoms bow to me because I have the name that which every knee will bow anyways. But the way I'm going to get there, Philippians 2 tells us, is through humbling myself, is through the cross. And so that's the same for the Christian. The things that are offered in the kingdom are great and they're glorious and they're beautiful, but the road is one of sacrifice. And so, I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy on that, but that's where I wonder if there's ways that we might face opposition that, man, they just play to exactly the things that we want. So,
Yeah.
but we might not be expecting that. So I don't know. You have thoughts on
Mhm.
that?
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of times where we can, like I said earlier, put persecution in a box of, not being able to proclaim the things we want to proclaim or meet in a meeting place. I mean, communist countries have experienced this. Behind the Iron Curtain after World War II, China, different places where it's hard to be a Christian. So I think that is kind of how our mind goes. But I think what you said is good. I also think I want to make sure I broaden this out to say it really is persecution, really is any type of opposition to the message and the person of Christ. So the gospel that we proclaim, our belief system, the scriptures that we believe in, and the God that we worship. Any opposition to that. Now that can happen in governments. It can happen in it's society and culture. It can happen from one religious group to another. So thinking about Christians, I think it can happen in our governmental systems. I think we stand up for things that are right. I think we stand up for scriptures. I think we uphold the biblical ethics that we have. I think that there is that. So all of that I think exists. I think we could probably point to some of the things that we're trying to fight against. I think people's minds go to things like abortion or even things like upholding the sanctity of what marriage looks like. And so I think that those are true things. I think we want to that is a sense of persecution. Let me just make one quick uh, um it's not a caveat, but just let me just flag something for us all. It's I don't see in the New Testament. Now I could be wrong. You could tell me this, but I don't see in the New Testament people saying they're persecuted because it's self-inflicted persecution, meaning they're going out in the streets and um they're so abrasive and they're so jerky that they get persecuted and they call that some sort of a win for being persecuted for Christ. The persecution comes through the actions of the church, where Paul, for example, is proclaiming a gospel of grace to a group of people because he so desires them to know. Even going into Athens, where he's confronted with all these gods, and he's just his heart is broken for that city. He's not calling them out as whores and whoremongers and that they're all going to hell and they need to repent, or he's not going out on his Twitter account and he's just not being a jerk for Jesus and get persecution. He's literally going into and pleading with the people to believe in a God. And he finds persecution for that in Philippi. He finds persecution for that in Ephesus. He goes to a bunch of different places like that. At no point does he take up some sort of holy banner like a crusade and call it persecution. I think we are in so much danger of that in our culture, especially our Christian culture in America, where we create controversy for the sake of controversy and call it persecution. Like I can't tell you I mean, how many pastors I've seen do that. And Like, I think that that's unwise. And we can go, we're going into election year. I think we can stand on principle, and we could be tempted to try and manufacture some of that. But I think that any type of genuine biblical persecution comes from a heart of love and a desire to win the culture and win the people that live in that society with the gospel. And when that happens, even if it's talking about standing for true things, marriage in and of itself is a representation of Christ in the church. So we uphold those things as biblically true, and we understand what that looks like. Abortion is image bearers being killed before they're born, and so we do uphold those things, but we uphold those things because we want those that believe a different ideology not to be shamed but to be saved. And I think that should always be our heart in terms of that. Even looking at the Christians who were killed in arenas and things like that in the Roman world, like, they weren't fighting back. I mean, it's Jesus, it's the Sermon on the Mount, not that defending ourselves or defending our families isn't necessarily, wise, and we don't have to do that, but it's not that, we go out and we just take whatever action as needed if somebody's gonna, call us something as Christians, or we have to be biblically sound. Purposely biblical is one of our values. So we have to uphold that. And when we find persecution, may it be because we love people so much that they hate us. And we love the gospel so much that they hate us, not because we are going out guns blazing, with angry words, and we're trying to rile up a culture and trying to, be clickbait people like that. I think that is not persecution. That's something else. But so anyway, I just wanted to make sure I clarified that too as we talk through it. So, anything to add to that, Tyler?
No, I just think you're drawing out the difference between persecution and consequences. So you gotta be
Mm-hmm.
careful that we're not calling consequences persecution,
Yeah.
because sometimes, and this is even true of churches, sometimes churches face the discipline of the Lord, and it's a good thing. And if you call discipline from the Lord persecution, you're going to miss the message that God's trying to give you. So yeah, I just think it's important to know the difference and to be clear-eyed about the difference.
Good. All right. Um, can you, as you've preached a number of sermons here in the Beatitudes, is there a specific takeaway from the series that you feel like, man, like, I even either as somebody who helped teach through it, or somebody that was just in the congregation and kind of reading it with everybody else, that you feel like, man, as we live for Jesus, I just think this is something we should really hold on to and grasp, and something maybe stood out for you, to you from this.
Yeah, I mean, I say one thing is just the opportunity before us to walk in the beauty of these and the witness that can be. But this could just be because throughout our time in the Beatitudes, I've been reading through Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers. I've been in the Old Testament, and um, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the Promised Land had kind of um, two big promises. One was provision; it's a land flowing with milk and honey, and the other big promise was the kind of new way of being that God was inviting the people into, and that was through the law. And the Sermon on the Mount is this kind of um, new installation of that in some ways. And so you have after the Beatitudes, you have all the essentially like the mirrors of the law given. And, so I have been kind of in my mind likening the Beatitudes to the milk and honey, to the provision in this New Testament kingdom that God's inviting us into. And so it's this fulfilling, sweet, flowing provision from God in the life of believers, this character that is reflective of the God who's inviting us into the kingdom. And so we experience it, but then also in the new covenant, we give it as well. We're providing it for others as well, because the work of the Spirit in us is providing that milk and that honey of the character of Jesus through our brothers and sisters. So I don't know. I guess that's like a reframing of the way I've kind of been looking at them, of like, oh man, this is such a gracious gift of God. These character attributes that He has remade us in the image of Christ to look like this. So when you think about them in depth, like we have, kind of digging deep into them, how much of a gift they are to us individually, but then how much of a gift they are to the community of believers, to the watching world, and how much I want to experience more of that. Like I want to experience more of that in my life, and I want to experience more of that in those around me. And so yeah, that could be totally like wacky, but to me it's yeah, I've been thinking about it in those terms. Like these beatitudes are the milk and honey of the New Testament kingdom, and how sweet they are and how much I just want to see them flow more and more. But what about you? What was the takeaway that you had?
I think there was a few, but I think the one that I would probably point to the most is just the realization that culture doesn't matter which culture we're in. It could be the Roman culture, the Roman Empire that that Jesus was in when he was in Israel. The Rome owned everything, and there could be that through the New Testament and all the way up through to today in our culture. But the way that God has called us to live for Him reflects Him, and culture reflects something different. And I think that that is it's hard to swallow in some ways because it's one of those things where everything that we're taught from when we're younger and we grow up, and everything that we're taught to value and love, everything that we're taught to hold on to, and and character attributes that we're taught to emulate and things like that are really in a lot of ways there may be hints of God in them, because we are image bearers, but ultimately, like, he's calling us to something really, I mean, radically different. Um, which is what I think what causes people to want to know more about the Lord. Like I was just listening to a podcast today, and they were talking about religion, and these are not Christians, but they were talking about religion. And one of them was just talking about how she had grown up in the church. She'd grown up in some sort of religious environment, Jewish maybe, and then she found Buddhism, and then she was in a church choir, and she said she just liked the idea of religion. And the host was talking about how he grew up Catholic, and he just felt guilty all the time, and it was really nice for him to find Buddhism because when he heard about it, because he's like, oh, there's another way this doesn't make me feel guilty. And I think when you think about, if you truly understand the scriptures in a Protestant way, like, it's sad to me when I hear him talk about growing up and feeling guilty all the time, for who he was as a person or his life. Because I think if we truly get the gospel and what Jesus is saying, it's not about guilt, feeling guilty. It's about recognizing a need. And I think that all of those things that I was just talking about in that podcast, what they were talking about, is just really pointing to a brokenness that they're trying to fill. People are trying to find something different. The world itself has proven itself to be broken in people's hearts and minds. And so as they're walking around trying to find something, people are grasping at straws, to try and find something that will make them whole. And when you come across genuine Christianity and life and Christ, that he has come to people and ransomed them and rescued them and redeemed them to live differently in a kingdom, it's not about guilt or shame. It's about joy that there's something different out there that we can experience. And that something different begins with the Savior who takes you out of your brokenness and makes you whole and brings you into a family, that's different, in his family. That's what I mean, like adopted into his family as an heir of Christ. And so, like, I think the very things that we look at as being so opposite and difficult to navigate in the world, whether that's, humility, peacemaking, we go back through meek, all the things we talked about in the Beatitudes, it really does paint a picture of a totally opposite world and kingdom than the one that we're living in, which is why I think that the gospel is compelling, because it adjusts the brokenness people are trying to mend, and it mends it, and it causes us to be different. And so I think that as we went through, I just was noticing that, like, man, this is just different. Like, this is a different culture that we want to abide by and live for, and I pray that we do it. So
Yeah, one of the commentaries that I was using when I studied had a list of all of the Beatitudes and then the counter values to those Beatitudes. And I spent time with those each time I prepared because I just thought it was fascinating, that stark difference between what Jesus celebrates and what the world celebrates. And those counter values are, by and large, were things that would really be celebrated um, in our culture, and actually in a lot of cultures. They're things that are celebrated. And here Jesus is saying, one of the phrases, I think maybe from that commentary, another one was, blessed are the cursed. Blessed are those who don't fit any of these counter values that are celebrated in culture. They fit a whole new list of values that culture actually says are cursed, and God says you're blessed. So yeah, just that stark difference, I hope stood out to all of us because it really should, and it sets up the whole Sermon on the Mount to really prepare you for a whole um, backwards way of living compared to the world, or upside down way of living, which flows out of values that are counter values to the world we live in.
yeah, good. That's great. You talked about at the very end, William Booth, who was the um, kind of the guy who started the Salvation Army, Christian in England, and he talked about how at the end of the day, when he was on his deathbed, they were having a meeting, I guess, to try and figure out some things, and he couldn't be there, but he wrote a telegram that just said others on it, kind of, I mean, probably just describing how he viewed life. It wasn't about him, it wasn't about them, it was about other people and how to think through that, which I think is very similar in some ways to our value of being joyfully generous. How do we think about our others? Even passionately one, how do we relentlessly outward? Most of our values actually it kind of is about how do we think about others in our lives. And it honestly does really mirror the heart of Jesus too. Jesus was not about, I mean, if you read Philippians 2, it was about others, and his whole life lived here was about others. Um, I just wonder if we could just talk about how our culture discourages that. We live in a culture, I think, that discourages others. We talk about it a little bit, but I think in the end of the at the end of every day, I think it's really more about, hey, what can you get? How do you think about you? So maybe let's just talk a little bit about how our culture discourages us to live like that and how we can maybe think differently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lame person to talk about this because I'm a Luddite in a lot of ways, but I think, one of the ways that our culture discourages us from another's mindset is just like through the technology that we have today. I do think that technology is more and more about making life easier and more efficient and making us more self-sufficient. And none of those things, well, those I should say, are all counter values to an others orientation. Being self-sufficient eliminates the need for others. Being efficient eliminates people because people are not efficient. People are super inefficient. Um, I just think that like our reliance on technology, the way that we don't question, what technology does to humanity, I think is something that runs counter to an other's mindset. So that's just me being a Luddite, but that's my opinion on that, is that I think we just need to be careful. And not that we don't use technology. You and I are talking over Zoom right now, right? So people are going to be listening to this on a podcast, which I listen to a lot of podcasts. So it's not to poo-poo on all technology all the time, but I think it is worth asking, like, is my use of technology and the different things that make life easier for me also making me more selfish and isolating me from others? I just think it's worth asking. So that's one value or counter value that I think culture gives us that's contrary to that others mindset. I mean, I think also, so one of the things that I didn't do when I preached that I thought about afterwards that I regretted was William Booth didn't start the Salvation Army by himself. His wife was really instrumental in his ministry. Her name is Catherine Booth, And she had this call where she felt like she was called to share the gospel with people. And she talks about how she felt like this compulsion to share the gospel. And then at the same time, she had an inner voice that was taunting her. And the inner voice was saying, "You will look like a fool and have nothing to say. If you go up and you try and share the gospel, you're going to look like a fool. You're not going to have anything to say." And the story goes that Catherine decided that that voice was the devil's voice. And her response to that voice was, "That's just the point. I've never yet been willing to be a fool for Christ. Now I will be one." And I think an others orientation is a really vulnerable thing. It's a willingness to look like a fool because you put yourself out there for others. It's a willingness to lose. And our culture is just very competitive, so losing is not valued. And our culture is very kind of image based. So to make yourself look like a fool, to make a decision where you'd be losing, I think is just not valued. In fact, I think it's looked down upon. So, I think some of those values are, countercultural to what Jesus did and what Jesus is inviting us to. The one who sits on the throne, the creator, stepping down and being in a lot of ways, obscure carpenter, and then having a failing ministry and dying on a cross and being rejected. Like, none of those things are success by our culture standard. And that's what Jesus did. And then he invites us to follow. So, but that, again, you talked about it. That's Philippians 2. That is all because of others. None of that is about me. So I don't know, I'm kind of rambling now, but those are some big things for me that I think about regularly. I want to be challenged and try and go, okay, yeah, culture wants me to go one way. It's going to give me a lot of resources to go that way. What is the way of Jesus, and where does that diverge?
Hmm,
Yeah, I don't know. What thoughts do you have?
good. No, I don't have any thoughts. I think that's really great. I wanted to mention one thing. William Booth, his wife's Catherine, right? One thing a lot of people don't know is that William and Catherine's son is John Wilkes, who
Stop.
infamously took out.
Stop.
It's not true. If you thought,
Yeah.
what? Really? No, that's totally not true. It's the only other Booth that I know. It's the only other Booth that I could think of, but that's
No,
not true.
they did have like 7 kids, but none of them assassinated any presidents. They
Okay,
all were Salvation Army kind of royalty and helped
good.
serve
Perfect.
Jesus.
Yeah,
So
don't take that seriously, everybody. There's like tweeting out, "Wow, I never knew this." No, no, not true. Um, Listen, the Beatitudes were great. We have a couple weeks coming up, talking about discipleship, talking about global missions. We have a sermon coming up at the beginning of August just to prepare our hearts for which kingdom we're living for as we think about November this year. And then we're going to be jumping into a longer series on local mission, really trying to think through our relentlessly outward value and wanting to grow in it. And so we have some things coming up that way, some ways that we want to call each other to just continue to be thinking about others, to talk about William Booth here again. But we want to be thinking about that. So looking forward to the end of August. I know everybody's kind of on vacation still, coming back, but come on back. I really want to encourage everybody to try and make as many of these Sundays as possible coming up. I think that there's a lot of things we want to make sure that we're hitting, especially in this mission series. If you can prioritize that on Sunday mornings, I think it's going to be very valuable. Let me call you all, just as you're thinking about leading families and things like that. Come to church, hear about what it means to live our lives for Jesus in front of others and for others. And let's see if we can't do that together. So everybody, go somewhere on Sunday morning this week. If you don't have a group that you want to go to, find a gathering, look at the email, look at social media, find a gathering, let them know you're coming, join that time, and let's spend time together this Sunday together. So anyway, you guys have a great time. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you soon.
all right, see you everyone.